Hello everyone, Scott here with another episode of the Interstellar Space Program. We are on episode 9. Woo, we're almost getting to double digits. Awesome. If you remember from the last episode, what we were doing was we were getting set up for a mission to Jool. We were going to go take advantage of all that antimatter out there. And in this episode, we get out there. We set up several probes and we get going. Now, this is the vehicle that I was building in the last episode. As you can see, it's complete. It's ready to go. We're just making sure that the Kerbal'ed drive has the right speed set on it, and taking a look around, just doing a final inspection to make sure everything was ready to go, and getting it into a position where I'm ready to start the drive. Now, before we do that though, there's one other prep thing that I have to do, and that is to get the antimatter I've been collecting off of my probe and the antimatter I've been manufacturing on my station onto it so that it has enough power to get out there, because the majority of its power is going to be coming from the antimatter reactor that's in the aft section of this ship. So as you can see here, I'm just setting up a maneuver node with the probe in order to get a rendezvous with the antimatter factory space station I have floating around Kerbin right now. And we're just going to go into there and take care of that. So once the probe docks with the space station, it'll pick up all the antimatter that I have stored there. And from there, it will ferry it out to the JAM vehicle that will carry it out to Jool. Now, if I'm correct, and I will be honest, I didn't entirely calculate this, but I should have enough antimatter and or power that I can beam into this craft to get it out to Jool. Now, keeping in mind the only fuel source that it carries is monopropellant, which is only used for its own maneuvering purposes. I built this vehicle without any other fuel supplies because the intent of it was to get it out there without the requirement of fuel, running it entirely upon beamed power and and antimatter generation, so that I would need zero maintenance, which turns out to work out fairly well here. And as you can see, I'm getting close to a rendezvous, so I'm just going to finish the maneuver here. We'll skip ahead to where the docking takes place. Pretty standard stuff. Docking with the space station is still pretty good. I get a little bit of lag here, but not much. I mean, the station's big, but it's not overly big. However, the JAM vehicle, the Jool antimatter vehicle that I've got in the opposite end of the orbit here, is very laggy. Has a great deal of parts on it, and it gets pretty slow at times. It was pretty painful to move it around. So anyway, it's no big deal. It does end up going out there, and then once I start deploying all the probes, it gets a little easier on my computer. I haven't got the greatest computer in the world, but it is, it's fairly good for this kind of stuff. So I'm just going to dock with the end of the station here because these large heat panels on the probe can tend to want to collide with things. So we'll just come in here nicely. I'll just transfer monopropellant, fuel, and the antimatter off the station, and basically just drop my probe's orbit in order to catch up with the station, because it's sitting at about 100 kilometer orbit around Kerbin at this point as well. Just quickly transferring some fuel, antimatter, and I also ended up dumping some of my tritium and beryllium back into the station because I don't really need it on this probe. And truthfully, once I use this probe up or it runs out of fuel, I may end up redesigning it with some of the newer parts that come out with Interstellar in the last patch, as well as some other ideas I want to try. This probe worked out well, but ultimately I think I can do better, and I'm going to try to do better. Isn't that the kind of the goal of life, is to always try to do better than what you did before? Just playing this series, for example, I've learned a great deal about improvements and ways I can do things, and ideas that I can utilize to make more interesting vehicles and get out there. So we're just going to skip ahead here to the rendezvous with the JAM vehicle. Now, this doesn't look too bad because I'm at 4x speed right now, but when I was actually doing the maneuver itself, it was incredibly slow, incredibly laggy. This JAM vehicle got very part intensive because not so much that it had a lot of big parts, but it had a great deal of smaller parts, batteries, panels, things of that nature, because the vehicle itself, the hind section, is designed to be a antimatter electrical generator, which then transmits and also acts as a relay. And then the front sections is basically 6 probes. 2 probes are going to be microwave network relays. The other 4 probes are going to be standard investigation probes for the various bodies around Jool, so that I can discover what resources are available to them and decide where I'm going to actually place a habitat within the Jool system. I mean, ultimately, the best candidate for habitation is Lathe, because of it's got an atmosphere very similar to Kerbal'ed. It's got a lot of water. Doesn't have a lot of landmass, but we can work around that. So we'll make that determination as we go here. But right now, I'm probably going to end up putting a man station around Lathe. I may put one around Jool. It just depends on if it's worth it, because pulling resources out of Jool is incredibly energy intensive. I mean, you can pull straight fuel, liquid fuel out of it with the air scoops. If some of you remember the episode or the shorty I did on the products you can pull with Atmos scoops. However, that being said, it does require a lot of energy to get in and out of Jool's atmosphere to the point where you can collect a meaningful amount of that energy or that fuel. And I'm still haven't come up with a vehicle design, an idea to really make it viable. Whereas with Lathe, because it's got an ocean, I can pull a lot of the same resources out of the water there with the Interstellar pack, with the refineries that come with it. I will consider this a little bit more as we go forward. In any case, we're just coming in with the docking on this probe right now. I'm just coming in on the docking port on the what looks to be the bottom side of the vehicle, although it doesn't really matter in space. Bottom and top are kind of subjective and almost irrelevant in any case. But regardless, we're just going to come in here. I'm going to dump the antimatter into this vehicle, and like I said, it looks like I'm actually being overly cautious coming into this docking maneuver, is because I'm coming in very, very slow. But trust me, that was mostly due to the latency, or the frame rate was dropping below single digits. It was in single digits when I was doing this, and just like, ouch, painful. I was almost debating and just saying screw it and just going without it, but I kind of need that antimatter because those plasma engines do burn a lot of energy in order to generate a reasonable amount of thrust. And the other thing to consider is those plasma engines, I've got a great deal of them. So I have to make sure I have enough energy to get me to Jool, and then I've got to have energy in the tank to do maneuvers, so that in case I need to correct an orbit or something along those lines, because when you're dealing with the AccuBear drive, it basically transports you to a certain location going exactly the same speed that you were when you left, which is relative to the planetary body that you were traveling on. Now, Kerbal'ed is, you know, it seems like it's going the same speed, but Jool, because it's on a larger orbit, is actually traveling faster, I believe is how it works. And once you get there, it's going to kind of change the way your trajectories go. As I was flying away with this vehicle, it kind of spun out because one of my engines shut down for some reason. I think I ran out of juice or something. But it's fine. But like I was saying with Jool, is when we get there, we're almost guaranteed to have to do some kind of orbital maneuvers to really correct it, because there's no way to predict exactly where you're going to end up with an AccuBear drive, especially since I didn't hotkey it before starting this thing, so I have to click on it with the mouse to turn on the warp and turn off the warp. I probably bound it to some action groups, but I didn't. In any case, so we're out of the Kerbal system. I just basically gave it a little shot of the AccuBear drive, just enough to pull me out of the Kerbal system to see where we were at with regard to Jool. And we just come out here, and then I take a look. Jool is almost straight out on an axis to us, which is pretty good. From here, I can pretty much, with this time, fire straight out to it, and I should be able to hit its gravity well and have the gravity well pull me in, so that I can do a stable orbit. If you go flying into a planetary body going a different speed, or if you're going in, I'm trying to think of the word, it's not adjacent, but if you go in from the wrong angle, basically, you're going to end up multiplying your speed coming out, which is going to make it really difficult to get captured by the planet's gravity. Now, Jool's also one of the biggest gravity wells in the system, short of the Sun, or Kerbal'ed. So it should be fairly easy to catch it. Now, if you notice, it said there that my antimatter storage had run out of power and it was going to explode, and I was like, hey, what the hey? So I stop and check it out. I think that was just a minor glitch with the physics increasing, or speed increasing, time warp, because it dropped my electrical charge down to 0, even though I was still generating power and collecting it through the solar panels. So fortunately nothing exploded, the vehicle stayed intact. All is good, all is well. Now I'm just coming in for my final approach here, and as you can see we're about to break into the sphere of influence that Jool has. I want to basically stop the AccuBear drive at that point and take a quick assessment of where my vehicle is in regards to it. As you can see, we're right on the outer tip of the Jool sphere of influence. In a few minutes, if I hadn't changed anything, we would have been out. So the next thing I do is I use the nav ball to aim straight at the planet again to try to get in closer, and then we just hit the AccuBear drive again to close the distance. And as you can see, even with the ball, it's very difficult to get absolutely accurate trajectories when you're using the AccuBear drive. So again, that's where I mentioned you have to kind of be prepared to do corrections when you're done. So I stop, and we're getting closer, but I'm still on a exit trajectory, so now I got to get closer to Jool. But the trajectory as it stands right now is getting fairly well affected by Jool. You can see it starts to curve back toward Jool a little bit before we actually exit, which is good. So then I aim for the planet again and fire one more time, and this time it looks like we're actually going to go through the planet, so I got to make sure I stop before we hit it. And shortly here I come in. I also slowed down my AccuBear drive so it's not warping as fast as it was before, just on the off chance that something could happen. In any case, so we come in and I stop, and hey, I've got an orbit around Jool. This is awesome. Two problems though. First problem, it's very inclined, and I want to correct that. The second problem is I'm actually going at the opposite rotation of the planet with regards to my spaceship, meaning the planet rotates one way while my ship rotates the other way. Now for docking and for energy consumption, that's not so great. So I fire up my plasma drive, as you can see here, and I start to correct it. First thing I do is I correct my orbital transition around the planet. I basically arrest my velocity and start heading in the other direction outright. It was quite a long, tedious, painful burn, as you can see here. This is me. Now, because we're in the Jool system as well, I'm collecting a fair amount of antimatter as I'm doing this. So it's actually maintaining the vehicle's thrust as we're going. I don't have to worry too much about energy. So now I've just got this vehicle coming in, and we've got our orbit. I'm rotating properly. I still got to do some inclination corrections, but it did get very hard on my antimatter. I'm just coming around my orbit now just to see where the best point is, and it looks like it's about 9,000 kilometers above the surface of Jool is where I found the best, or I guess the densest resource, densest point of the antimatter. So I want to get myself a half decent 9,000 kilometer orbit around the planet, and that's where I'm going to park my collectors, my antimatter generators, and my relays. So again, skipping ahead because it was a lot more painful burning, and I had to actually stop and let the vehicle rotate a few times just to collect more antimatter so that it could finish the job. We get to the point where it is, and I still had a little bit in the tank, but then I open up the panel to see how much power we would generate, and it gives me the about 71 gigawatts when it's got antimatter in the tank, but that burns through fairly quick. Once we get the antimatter emptied out here, I end up with, I think, about 4.5 gigawatts of sustainable power being transmitted constantly. Now it's burning every piece of antimatter that it collects at this point, so that's basically where it's going to stabilize that. Now that's still pretty good, considering that's better than any one reactor that I have in the Kerbal system. I had to put a couple of other reactors up there just to do the same amount of power sustainably. So the next order of things that I've got to do here is I've got to get my relay system around Jool so that I can beam the power around it entirely regardless of where the reactor is, or the antimatter reactor is. Now I also ran into a bit of a problem here, and this is an interesting point that I want to make with this, is this vehicle, when I initially popped it off my mother vehicle, it couldn't pull the power from it for some reason, even with the dish open. I wasn't sure why. Might have been a glitch or something along those lines. Anyway, all I had to do to fix that was to go off this probe, go back to the Space Center and reload it. Then as soon as I came back to the probe, it was able again to see that the vehicles were two separate entities and therefore pull the power. In this case, I'm just using the probe. I'm slowing down its orbit a bit so that it can start to get ahead of the reactor portion. And then we're just going to do that for a few revolutions around the planet until it gets to a point where I'm happy to bring its orbit back up. And as you can see here, I was having a little bit of fun with the engines shutting down on me, and I'm not sure why. And basically, this probe, because I haven't really, the only heat sinks I've got on it are on the outside sides of the engines. When I'm pulling power into it from the antennas and from the relay, it tends to overheat real quickly and shut things down on me. So that's fine, because ultimately once these pieces are there, you don't have to worry about the heat, because they'll dissipate all they create. They won't be receiving energy. All they'll be doing is relaying it, and a relay doesn't generate any heat, at least not that I'm aware of, because I've never seen any of my relays overheat. Anyway, so we're just going to finish that up, and then once I get it approximately where I want it, I just bring the orbit back up to the same level that the reactor is at. And from there, make sure that its orbital duration matches. The inclination and stuff like that isn't quite as important as the orbital time. If you get the times almost identical, then you shouldn't have any problem with their orbits decaying, and then, you know, all of a sudden you've got some dark spots in your power network and things of that nature. Now we're just going to tweak it a little bit to get it right. These probes I built, I thought would be a little bit more stable than the previous ones that I brought, but for some reason when I'm using that Infernal Robotics stuff on that, sometimes it tends to bring the probe off balance a little bit, and they tend to be a little hard to fly. They still get to where I need to go, so it's no big deal. And I'm just trying to find the decoupler here to decouple this probe, but it's kind of hidden in the vehicle a bit, and if I have to do a little rotating until I finally get a point where I can get at it, and we detach. And again, it's not seeing the vehicle, the power being generated from the antimatter vehicle, so I have to go back to the Space Center and come back, reload it, and then it works out just fine, as you can see here. So we're just getting ready, and now this one, the last one, I dropped the orbit, which means I slowed it down so that it could get ahead of the antimatter section. This one I'm actually going to raise its orbit. I'm going to speed it up so that it can fall behind. That way it's a little less distance travel, less revolutions to get to where I want it to go. As you can see here, again, the vehicle for some reason tended to want to pull a little funny when I thrust it up with its engines. Someone, I think, mentioned that was a known issue because I had too many vehicles in close proximity, something to that effect. I'm not 100% sure why it does that. Nevertheless, it was manageable. I was able to get it to where I needed to be in order to do the job that it was intended for. So once we get this to where it needs to be, basically I'll be using the 3 relay sort of system that I've been using around Kerbal'ed, around the moon, stuff of that nature, just so that we can bounce the signal around. That way, regardless of what your orientation to Jool is, you should be able to receive power on something like that at any point. Just going to finish all that stuff up here momentarily, and we'll be in a position where I could take advantage of it, as you can see. Basically, once we get this all set up, then the next thing we've got to do is start to investigate the bodies for energies and or resources that we can take advantage of, so that I can bring out some Kerbals to do some stuff, or just, you know, to say that I did. I also brought 4 probes with me on the Jam mission. But some of you might be saying, well, why didn't you bring 5? Because there's 5 moons around Jool, and not only that, there's also Jool itself, which makes 6. And I want to say, well, I couldn't really do 5x symmetry in the game. It doesn't really allow you to do 5x symmetry. And I was thinking, you know, I want to say that, yeah, it's because of the 5x symmetry, and then 6 would have been too much, yada, yada, yada. But truthfully, I kind of forgot, and for some reason, I had it in my head that Jool had only 4 moons. And I was like, when I got here, I was like, oh yeah, whoops. Anyway, it's not a huge concern. Next time I come out here, I'll bring 1 more probe, and truthfully, I'm probably going to just not send it out to one of the furthest away moons, because it'll take a long time to get there, and it's very unlikely I'm going to be able to take advantage of the resources anyway. So, for example, it'll either be Bop or Pole that won't get a probe from this mission. So we're just finishing the last little tweaks to this relay here, and then we'll get back to we'll have the 3-point system that I have been using around Kerbal around the moon. Same sort of distribution pattern. Works very well. At about 9,000 K around Jool is about pretty good. I mean, it does give you a little room for error, but it is a little close to the body, so you got to be pretty close with your tolerances in order to make sure you get power without losing too much. So now I'm just going to set up the other panel on this to be the relay. I don't really need it to do anything right now beyond that, so I figured I may as well just turn it on the off chance that it does relay some power if it's getting it from the sun or from Kerbal. By chance the power from one of those two places is actually getting here, then I can still relay those around as well and potentially have more power pool to get from. That may be wishful thinking, I'm not 100% sure, but nevertheless, we start launching these probes and donk! Whoops! Slight design flaw. The little strut or the little girder that I had that was the relay probes were sitting on is actually in the way of this probe as we were sending it out, so it bounced off and I was like, oh man. Fortunately, there wasn't enough force that it caused any damage, so I wasn't too worried about that after the fact. But anyway, we just opened this up, and again, similar problem. I have to go back to the Space Center and reload it in order to bring it back so that it can see the energy being beamed from the main reactor. So this first probe, I'm actually sending it out to Tylo first, because from where I just deployed it, it was the easiest to get to it was easiest in the rotation to get to. So we'll start with Tylo. That one's a fairly straightforward one. Get that one going. It's good. Its maneuver node is ready to go. The next one I'm sending out, and again that design flaw shows up because dunk bounces off the truss. Now the next probe that we get out here, this one that I've just deployed, is going to end up going to Lathe, and then the following one after that is going to end up going to Pole, and the last one ends up going to Val. And the reason I skipped Bop was mostly because its inclined orbit was kind of difficult to match up, and I won't lie, I still have to rely on maneuver nodes for most things. I'm not any astronomer here. I'm more of a technician or technical guy. I like parts and stuff and building gadgets and things. But anyway, that being said, those were the ones that I ended up going to with the 4 probes that I had available to me. As you can see here, this one is just lining up for Lathe, and truthfully I'm probably going to end up going to Lathe with my permanent station here, because again I can put Kerbals on the surface and it can feel like home. And they can survive there most likely. They'll just have to bring their water wings to make sure they don't sink. And the thing is, if you've got a planet with an ocean, Interstellar does give you the opportunity with the refineries to pull liquid fuel and oxidizers straight out of the water. But we'll get more into that as we get going further in this series. I do want to basically have a station on each planet as we go here. The other ones, like Duna and Eve, will be interesting. I haven't decided how I'm going to get resources off there yet, because you can... The Interstellar mod will let you collect their atmospheres and turn them into fuels. However, it's methane fuel. It's not liquid fuel or hydrogen, and therefore isn't held by standard tanks, and some engines can't use it. All the Interstellar engines can, but none of the stock vanilla Kerbal engines will. So I'll have to decide if I'm going to have to go with kethane on those ones, or if I'm going to end up using methane for those particular ones, as you can see here. Now, for the remainder of this episode, because it is carrying on a little longer than I had intended, I'm just going to kind of skip through it, because most of the last part of this is just getting orbits around the various planets or the various moons around Jool and correcting their inclinations. I'm going for polar orbits on them all, stuff of that nature. So it's like Lathe, I'll be scanning for the resources, and I found a great deal of thorium, and I think there's a lot of kethane there, but it's inaccessible because it's under the water. But yeah, I wanted to make sure this episode stayed task oriented rather than, you know, as soon as I get to a certain point I just cut it off and end it, because that was kind of my sort of goal, or my outline when I started these, was I was going to do one particular task per episode, so I'm not cutting people off halfway through and wondering. And you know, I do have other things outside of these games to do with my life, so I can only really get 1 or 2 out a week max, and sometimes I can't even do that depending on how busy I get. Anyway, the last little thing I wanted to mention before we go here is when I'm actually getting to Pole, it's got a very low gravity, so it's very hard to hit. So my first attempt to get out there, I actually missed. I had to do another correction later on to actually make sure I got a sphere of influence change I only get it for like 30 minutes max, so I got to make sure I can slow down and finish it while I'm there. Otherwise, I'm going to go flying back into Jool's sphere of influence, and you know, to correct it at that point might get quite difficult. But the good news is, because this was a fuelless system that I brought out here, it should work just fine. I can basically make more mistakes and should be okay. As you can see here, I'm doing a little bit of a lateral thrust here to bring my orbit over so that I can finally get that sphere of influence, because it's very, very touchy and one of the harder bodies to get to. And because it's so far out in the system here, it takes my probe like 4 days to travel out there. I'm probably not going to worry about it, you know, actually colonizing it. I might send some missions out there just to say we did it, but you know, that'll be it. And I'm finishing the last one here. This one is the Val probe, I believe. I'm just finishing its sending out there and its encounter, and we're all set. So yeah, we're getting there. I'm just finishing up. That would be Tylo. This one I think had a fairly high gravity, so it was very easy to get captured and move around. And you can see there's some resources on it already to take advantage of, although I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to do that. We will figure it out as we go. It just depends on what my needs are. I really just want to have a Kerbal station or something in that in every system in the Kerbal planets to refill any ships or to do all kinds, you know, do that kind of stuff. Then I'd ultimately consider this complete, because there's not much more I can do with it. And we'll go from there. I mean, then we'll see what other mods are out there. It depends. I might, you know, hang up Kerbal Space Program for a time, because there's some other games out there that I'm interested in playing and spending some time on. And if anybody's interested in other games besides these Kerbal tutorials, maybe I'll get into that kind of stuff too and do some Let's Plays and things. I don't know. It's all kind of up in the air. I've been doing these for fun, and I've been enjoying it, and I've been getting some interesting feedback from the people that have been watching my videos, and you know, maybe improving my oral dictation skills a bit. That was kind of one of the things I wanted to do these for, was to just kind of improve my public speaking or my dictation skills. So, in any case, we're just finishing up this, and that would be Val, I believe. I could be wrong. In any case, we are pretty much done for this episode. This is Scott Cook signing off. You guys have a great time. We'll see you later. Goodbye.